very cool. I would love to read more about this particular culture.
And I think that's the point of this
Yep.
book, right? A mix of different alcohols with a bunch of spices and things.
Yeah, good old punch.
Punch.
You didn't have punch in college, Tristan?
I'm not familiar with that term. Must be a Florida thing.
Maybe.
Hittites definitely won, but Egypt said they also won.
Right.
That's kind of how it went.
They had the oldest known equestrian training manual.
Yeah.
It covers everything from diet to exercise in order to train these horses to pull their chariots in warfare.
And I enjoyed the geekiness, the enthusiasm for it. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harrenstein, and with me as always, my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today, we are starting a new book, The Other Ancient Civilisations by Raven Todd Da Silva. You may know her by her internet handle, Dig It With Raven, on YouTube and TikTok and such. We found out she's written a book covering a variety of civilizations that she feels needs more attention than they get, and so we thought that sounded like a good book for a podcast. But before we get into that, we have our usual housekeeping. Here at Archaeology Books for Fun, we are sharing our enthusiasm for archaeology in the past, and you can help us reach more people by dropping a like, subscribe, and if you really want to make our day, a comment or a review. If you want to support us even more, you'll also find a donation link in the description.
And yes, we love those comments.
We really do. They do actually make our day.
I love them. I think they're so fun.
So today, like I said, we're starting a new book. I think it's a good book for us to be covering. It deals with some things that we have covered before and some new things. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it too. And I think it's awesome because it's a good introduction, surface level introduction. She says in her introduction that this is a book that's meant to give you an overview of these cultures. So don't expect like super detailed information, but if you're interested in learning about some maybe lesser known cultures, this is a great starting point.
Yeah, and she covers that in her introduction to the book too. She takes care to emphasize that she's not intending this to be an othering of these cultures, and she's not saying that the other civilizations that, we talk about so much are not worthy of it, but more that these civilizations are also worthy of discussion, and they kind of get overshadowed by more powerful civilizations, more long-running civilizations going on at the time.
And what a cool premise for a book.
Yeah, that's a great premise. I noticed she emphasizes that none of these civilizations, the ones we're talking about, or the big civilizations, or even the ones we don't talk about, were isolated. They are actually part of a bigger community. They're all doing trading and networking with each other. I have been using it because it is used in the book, but I did note that we tend to default to civilization in this book. And we've talked about that before, how it's not a favored term anymore, I'd say.
And I think she touches on that. Am I incorrect?
She does, but she doesn't really come to a conclusion for it, I don't think. She says it's not, and then she just kind of lets it sit, and then tends to switch between culture and civilization. I
do think overall she does a really good job of wording things in a non-threatening way. I don't know, but she uses her words very carefully.
Yeah.
I really enjoy her writing.
The use of civilization is maybe a bit of a critique, but overall the book is carefully written.
And I think in this context, for a book that's a surface level kind of introduction, you're using a word that people are familiar with. I think I'm okay with it in this context.
And I feel like the way the conversation is going, it tends to be about a mixture of being about the culture and being about the cities.
Yeah.
And maybe those two concepts combined makes it worth maybe using that term sometimes, whereas another book who had this discussion that we were not as thrilled with probably could have just used culture and it would have been better.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I noticed too, she also talks about the problems of calling a civilization lost, which is another conversation we've had a few times.
Yeah, I was really happy to see that in another book, honestly.
I was too. I found it interesting reading the chapters because, and maybe we'll get to some of this, but I felt like the language sometimes flirts with the idea of talking about the civilization as lost.
I've noticed that too, but I feel like she kind of circles back.
Yeah, and
like
then sometimes very carefully words it as otherwise. So
yeah.
It's an interesting, I feel like sometimes it's almost a holdover language or something that's maybe getting itself in there somehow. I'm not sure on that. But not a major critique, just some observations I've made so far. But the introduction, pretty standard, I think.
Yeah, I did notice that she used the puzzle analogy, and I even put in my notes, Tristan's gonna love this.
Yep. Yep, that has been my go-to metaphor for talking to kids in particular about archaeology and archaeological concepts. Basically, the idea is our past is a puzzle, missing the box and most of the pieces. Archaeology helps us see the picture. And she more or less uses that exact same metaphor.
Well, and I like the fact that she talks about, even in the best of circumstances, we're looking at fragments of the story because there's going to be organic remains and things that didn't survive. We'll never know their songs, their myths, unless they were written down, things like that. And I think that's really important for people to understand because we get a lot of questions at festivals and things about like people seem to think of a lot of archaeological theory in absolute terms and stagnant terms, like things do not change. But we're always finding out new things based on the archaeological record and what we discover. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
And something that comes up in the book a few times is sometimes we don't know what the people call themselves.
Yes.
So the names we use are the names we've given them. That is not necessarily, or almost certainly not, what they call themselves.
Yeah.
All right, ready to start with the first one? First chapter is the Akkadians, titled The World's First Empire.
This is one I had heard of in passing, maybe. I wasn't very familiar with them, but they're, I guess, in the Near East. One thing I like about this book, and I'm very thankful for, is she has maps. Because it's been a while since I took my world history courses, and so I'm not super familiar with some of these areas. And also, these places change so often throughout history.
So this was a civilization, at least for part of its time, that was contemporary with Egypt, and actually had some interactions with Egypt. Very militaristic and kind of built on conquest, which I know of other cultures that have done that before. And typically when they're built like that, either they need to change at some point or they are relatively short-lived. So the Akkadians were around for only a couple hundred years, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, and I guess
a few generations.
As far as we can tell as of right now, they're probably one of the first like professional military forces in history, which is kind of cool. And it's amazing that we don't really know, they're lesser known when they interacted with the Egyptians and some other cultures. It makes me wonder how many of these cultures that interacted with Egypt helped shape Egypt, and we're not really taught that.
And vice versa, too, really. Yeah. I think I was thinking of a different group when I brought that up, but they would have still probably interacted with them on some level.
Yeah, and I think because they were in Mesopotamia, I believe. So almost definitely, I would imagine. And even like we learn about Mesopotamia, but thinking back on it, I think the only real culture I learned about was the Sumerians. And I never realized how many other culture groups were in that area throughout time.
Yeah. One thing I want to bring up for this one, we don't have to do it for all of the chapters, but every chapter starts with kind of what I think of as a historical fiction piece.
Oh, yes. Yes. I really enjoy those.
And so she takes just a page or two and writes a little historical fiction piece based off of the archaeology about what may have been going on, what people may have been experiencing. And that's a good way of building into the chapter, but also, now I'm not just being told things. She's done a little bit of an interpretation about the people involved, which is, I thought, pretty good, pretty well done.
I think it's a really creative way to bring the humanity into the archaeology because, again, it's about the people, right? So starting it off with a narrative about a person or, a couple people, but it also, not all the time, but oftentimes, and one of the things she tries to hit on several times throughout this book is archaeology can tell us about the everyday lives of the common person, not necessarily, a lot of times we study almost exclusively in some cases the royals or the elite status folks, and the common folk are kind of forgotten about.
I think that has changed a lot in the last 30 years.
And I think she discusses a little bit about that in some of the chapters here, where she talks about how you used to study the elites and now we're starting to be a little bit more interested in the everyday person.
Yep, I agree. Sometimes the everyday person is a little harder to study, though.
Right,
Because they don't necessarily have the giant tombs, they don't have the giant palaces and such.
Yeah.
I think the only other thing I'd add about the Akkadians here is their politics were interesting because, so they are at a time of like city-states, essentially.
Right.
And they are conquering neighboring city-states and making satellites out of them and everything. And they would just kind of adopt everyone's gods.
Which I thought was really fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it was apparently, I think it was political.
Yeah.
Because, your god has moved to our city, so they condoned our invasion of your city is kind of the idea, and it's like, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it was interesting. Another thing I really like that she points out a lot is the writing systems and the linguistics, and how she points out with several of these, like whether or not they wrote on, or they may have written on parchment, and that's why we don't know, their language and things. And I guess the story at the beginning of this one, the historical narrative, is about a woman, I think the daughter of the king, writing a poem or a hymn on paper.
And she is the oldest named author that we have record of.
Right, which is so cool. Yeah, and it was a woman. All
right, so next chapter then is Dilmun, I think is how I would try to say it.
That's my best guess. And if we're wrong, somebody please comment and correct us.
Yeah, so this is another civilization that was a huge major trading port and kind of just disappeared for a long time. And we have clues to where it might be, but according to the book, I didn't have an impression that we had confirmed for sure that we had found it.
Yeah, I think she mentions that this is kind of a trickier one because we don't have a ton of archaeology on where the exact location is.
Like, we only know about it because it's been mentioned in some records in other cultures.
Right. And I guess one of the things they think is maybe because the history of this area is so old that it may have been built upon, so there's multiple layers of civilization upon each other, and maybe we just haven't gotten to where this layer is yet.
Right. The current idea is that there's an island off of Bahrain where they think it was located.
Yes.
And so this was a major trading port, had all kinds of good resources. It actually was very important for its source of fresh water. So traders could stop and refill their fresh water supplies as they go by.
And I guess one of the ways we know that this place even existed was because of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was, I believe, mentioned
it was one
in
of them,
there.
yeah.
So that might be something our listeners are familiar with.
Gilgamesh is cool. A couple interesting things about them is they actually built their cities on a grid pattern, which is kind of amazing to think that long ago people were building on grid patterns.
Yeah.
They had that concept.
Yeah.
And I guess we didn't say, this is looking at 4,000 BCE? I think I got that wrong. Must be 2000 BCE.
Yeah, so prominent 2050 to 2000 BCE.
And was really powerful and influential for a while. And like I said, it just kind of was surprising to me to hear grid patterns for cities.
And they also had like a standard weights system.
Yeah, so they borrowed from someone else.
Yeah.
I saw. Where was
from
that?
the Indus Valley, I think.
Yeah. We'll talk about Indus Valley later.
Yeah. But I just think it's so neat that so long ago, things were so precise. You don't often think about that.
And then it was prominent for a few hundred years. And then the city itself kind of went in decline. Number of reasons, possibly. Actually, in keeping with poor lost cities, typically the civilizations that have disappeared, quote unquote, are typically the reasons are going to be a variety of things. So political factors, internal or external political factors, and environment.
Yeah.
So typically you need at least two of those three to really end one of these groups. And that's why most of them have disappeared or dissipated is a key point, because most of them don't die as we think of them sometimes in Western culture. They have simply changed into something else, or they have merged with other groups. And so they're not gone, but just...
And she touches on it briefly, but how burial practices change as the culture changes.
Mhm.
And I guess with this culture particularly, you can see how the cemeteries change as the culture progresses, which I thought was interesting.
Next chapter. You might have noticed we're kind of doing this a little rapid fire because 5 different cultures and the time for the episode is quite a lot to cover. So we're just covering some highlights from them.
Yeah, and I think that's fine because the author says it's kind of
It's an intro.
Yeah.
But next up is actually a group of people that is not completely new to us in this podcast. It's the Etruscans.
True. I didn't even think about that, but duh.
They were mentioned briefly in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, but they really took a little bit of time with them in Ancient Brews. We had a whole chapter about the Etruscan grog.
Yes.
Which I actually noted here, the author of this book says, pottery found indicates that wine was consumed at a grand scale.
Yes, I know.
And we learned from Ancient Brews that maybe a little more accurate term would be grog, because typically it seems like mostly what they're consuming was a mix of different alcohols with a bunch of spices and things.
Yeah, good old hunch punch.
Hunch punch?
You didn't have hunch punch in college, Tristan?
I'm not familiar with that term. Must be a Florida thing.
Maybe.
So Etruscans are interesting, though, because I had heard of them before as kind of precursors to the Romans, but not much more than that.
Right.
But it seems like they are actually basically native to the area. They are like the Stone Age folks that developed in one place instead of moving around like a lot of the other ones.
Right, which is so funny because when you learn about the history of that area and the Etruscans and the Romans and all that, that's never brought up.
No. Well, I don't know how certain that is or how recently we figured that out. They have tried to trace the language. Is that this one? And they found a couple very remote places that seem like they're descended from the Etruscan language. But otherwise, it's kind of like some other languages like, I don't know, like Basque and stuff that have no relatives anywhere else, and they're just kind of their own thing.
I will say, I love how this author brings in linguistics. As much as I hated linguistics in college when we were doing linguistic anthropology, I think it is really, really important for people to understand that we can, at least to some degree, trace the movement of cultures and cultural practices by way of language.
Yeah, I like this kind of linguistics.
Right, yeah.
I think one thing I would want to talk about with this one is I did pick up something that seemed like a little bit of a stretch. There is apparently some Etruscan story about a child with an old man's face giving them knowledge about the heavens and such, and they actually did haruspicy is how I would pronounce that, but it's fortune telling with animal entrails.
Yes, this was a little interesting to me.
Yeah, and so the author said they found near one of the cities a deep hole with a child burial near the bottom that might add some real life plausibility to this mythical story, which felt, and then it just kind of left it at that.
Well, and it said that it may have been epileptic.
Yeah.
But I would be interested in knowing whether or not you can tell that from skeletal material.
Well, and what do you mean by real life plausibility? Like this was a ritual related to that? It almost seemed like it was implied that this could have been the child.
Right.
Which
how would you
feels like a really weird thing to claim.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like we're just missing some information there, but I would have liked a little more helping me understand what that statement is based off of.
Right. Yeah. Agreed.
But very interesting overall. Any big things you noticed in this one, Barbara?
I know. Going back to the haruspicy, they talk about the liver that they found, the
that's
bronze
cool.
liver or whatever it was that shows all the different nodes and things that they could read to help.
Yeah, it was a bronze map essentially.
Yeah.
And then it mapped the different gods' locations
on
in
the
liver.
Yeah, it seems pretty cool. I think they have a picture of it in the book,
there is a
too.
picture of it in the book, and if I can manage it, I'll get it in the video version of this.
Just kind of a funky artifact to come across.
The next chapter, we have Great Zimbabwe.
Which I really enjoyed this chapter just because I feel like this is something we're not really taught a lot about, especially in the United States. Maybe in other countries it's different, but we're taught like Africa existed and that was about it, but we don't really necessarily go into many of the individual cultural groups.
Which is, I don't know that I want to say by design, but it's probably kind of by design.
Yes.
And that is discussed in this book a little bit too. Because culturally it has been advantageous to say nothing of important happened in these regions, so that there's nothing wrong with us taking advantage of it, is the line of thought involved.
Well, and I mean, that is also presented in the archaeology of Great Zimbabwe as well. there's a history, and she goes into a little bit about it, that archaeologists were sent there essentially to prove that it wasn't the people who lived there that created these great structures.
Because it wasn't their structures, then the Europeans were morally fine to loot it all the heck, basically.
Yeah.
So actually, I found it interesting in early 1900s, 1926, 1929, there were a couple archaeologists that did work in the area, and when they started to realize, no, this was the local people that did this. And I was comparing this to what we were hearing about in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries regarding the North American Mississippians. And so this is probably about 50 years after that was happening in North America.
Yeah.
So that doesn't really surprise me, but that it is a similar path to what was going on there, where people were trying to say, no, there's no way the Native American groups in North America could have built these amazing mounds. And
yeah, I mean, well, it sounds like, the ruling political party was essentially blocking these archaeologists and the information they were trying to get out there. And it wasn't until the 1980s that the true story of who created these structures was really widely accepted. And that blows my mind. That's our lifetime.
Right. That's probably why we didn't hear about it before.
Right. Yeah, that's probably, true. But I think it's a good example, too, with a lot of the early destruction that was done by looters and by people trying to essentially hide the truth. A lot of the information was lost, and we'll never really be able to reconstruct completely or close to completely the history of Great Zimbabwe. And I feel like that's a really, really good example of why the context of sites is so important. I think this is a really good example of that and the damage that can be done by looting.
So some things that we know about Great Zimbabwe, of course, there's more in the chapter than we're going to cover here, but they were once again a very major trading power, had a lot of influence, and you see them kind of start to develop and then really expand when the trading really takes off with outside groups. The city itself was a little complicated. I had a little trouble following this, but it had 3 walled structures to it, built at different times. And apparently there was an interesting thing with their rulers where I hadn't heard about this system before, where when a ruler dies and he has multiple sons, instead of splitting everything up amongst those sons then take turns in power.
Yeah.
And instead of people moving to the palaces or whatever when they're in power, they turned their existing home into more of a palace structure with walls and stuff. To a little unclear on how much they needed, how much warfare was involved, I think, but very interesting and complicated.
Yeah, I really like this chapter.
Yeah.
I would love to learn more about them.
And there are soapstone birds found, and apparently this imagery is still very important and present today.
Yeah, it's on I actually looked it up. It's on their flag and their official crest or seal.
So yes, once again, this is a good example of a civilization or a culture that might traditionally have been said as lost, but it is not lost. There are people descended from them today.
Yeah.
And still influenced by them. So it is not lost.
Just very cool. I would love to read more about this particular culture.
And I think that's the point of this book, right? It's not. It is to get you excited, interested in certain things, and a little invested in some of these cultures.
Yeah.
And it's actually doing a good job of that.
I was just going to say the author's doing a great job, because I could create a list of all the books I want to read based on what I've learned from this book.
Yeah, and we might.
We might.
So last chapter for today is about the Hittites. And this one is all about horses.
Yeah,
largely.
I'm a horse girl. I was really fascinated by these chariots and the way that they, I guess, manned their chariots, I guess, was a little bit different. So very cool.
Yeah, and this is once again a culture that I had experienced through in passing. It's mentioned in the Bible for a long time. That's the only way anybody knew they existed.
Yeah, that's the only time I've ever heard of them.
And then I also know of them from Ghostbusters.
Oh yeah, you had said. I don't remember that, but
Ghostbusters will randomly list off some of these ancient cultures as part of like whatever they're doing, because they sound mystical, I think is why they were doing it.
Gotcha. So. I guess I need to go back and rewatch.
Yeah, well, it doesn't add anything to this conversation today, really.
Shocking.
But yeah, so this one was also contemporary with ancient Egypt and had a few squabbles with them even.
Apparently.
Where were they located?
In Anatolia, the modern day Turkey.
Modern day Turkey, okay.
Yes.
Which is a long ways to actually have land-based warfare.
Yeah, I guess they were all over the place, it seems like.
They're
Asia
quite large,
Minor, Upper Mesopotamia, like everywhere. Pretty cool.
So yeah, they had a pretty significant battle with Egypt. Actually, this was kind of cool because, wait, was this the one? Yeah, because they had a significant battle, and I think we have records from both sides.
Oh, yes.
But then they had resulted in the first peace treaty.
Yeah, like nobody really won, and they just kind of said...
Well, it seems like the Hittites definitely won, but Egypt said they also won.
Right.
That's kind of how it went. But then they actually had the new ruler for the Hittites came in, and they wanted to have peace with Egypt, so they actually wrote out the first peace treaty.
Yeah.
And we have copies of this treaty in both the Hittite territory and in Egypt.
Yeah.
Which is super cool.
And I would be remiss as a horse girl if I did not mention that they have the oldest known equestrian training manual.
Yeah.
Which sounds very specific. I wish I could get this specific with my training, but it was a 214-day training program. It covers everything from diet to exercise in order to train these horses to pull their chariots in warfare. So cool.
Yeah, and their chariots were different from other chariots too. They moved the wheel forward more, which allowed them to actually have 3 men in the chariot opposed to the typical 2.
Right, and there was one person who was just, their sole job was to protect the people in the chariot so that the one person could drive the chariot and the other person could fight offensively, I guess.
Probably bows or javelins or something, yeah. And then one apparently just had a shield, more or less.
Yeah, I guess it says here that they did so with spears and composite bows.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
But very cool.
Yeah, very fun. Here's an example of where the book does kind of flirt with the lost civilizations, but it doesn't always do this. The Hittites themselves disappeared from history and lay waiting to be rediscovered until the 19th century.
And I think by that, it's kind of meaning like maybe written history. I don't know. I don't think of like history as necessarily archaeological.
No, for sure. And so based on what we've heard before, there are probably cultural descendants, and some of these people probably knew where some of these places were.
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe this is one of those cases where there really doesn't seem to be anyone who did. So I don't know for sure, but it just, every once in a while we'll kind of dip into that language, and then sometimes we'd very carefully avoid that language. So I find it interesting, and I'd like to know, how maybe that was very calculated. And that'd be very interesting to me what the author was doing there.
And something I found really interesting, just because the only time I had ever heard of these folks was in the Bible. They had guidelines that they kind of ruled by, or, based their laws on. And the laws were entirely secular, which I was just like, wow, I've only heard of you folks in the Bible, but your laws were secular. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And then I don't need to go into this, but I was amused because she gets really into looking at Hittite texts to try and figure out if a particular recorded war happened or not, and she gets really geeky about it. And I enjoyed the geekiness, the enthusiasm for it.
Yeah, I really appreciate her focus on the language and the written word, just because I don't feel like a lot of archaeology texts really focus on that a lot.
Yeah,
which is weird.
And we don't in North America, just because I think sometimes it's a little sparser.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have found that there's more written language than we thought until not that long ago, but it's still not as common to find it around here. So maybe that's something that we just don't focus on as much in the Americas.
Yeah, maybe. And I do note, she talks a lot about environmental factors too, especially in this one. She talks about drought, and I do appreciate that she talks about using tree ring samples to note when a drought took place. So it's not just dates that you can get from tree rings, it's also environmental information, specifically, I guess, rain.
Right.
But I thought that was a really good little tidbit to throw in there.
Yeah. So that's our last chapter for today. How are you feeling about the book, Barbara?
I am really enjoying it. I think it's a quick read, because it is just kind of surface level, but it
isn't that, though. Sometimes it does get much more into the weeds about certain things. It just feels like there's a lot more than is able to cover it in this.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm actually impressed in the way the author can write these very precise chapters about all these different cultures. I feel like that is probably more challenging than writing a book on one particular culture and being able to go deep.
Yeah.
So I really, she did a fantastic job, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. I am enjoying the read overall for sure, and getting a lot out of it. And it's kind of fun to revisit these couple that I know a little bit about, and then some of them, I think a lot of them I've heard the name, but that might be kind of where it stopped a lot of the time.
Yeah, same.
So it's good to get some more depth on some of this, and now we've come across them in the future. We'll have, oh yes, remember we have some point of reference for it.
Right, yeah.
So I think that's all we've got for today. We're really enjoying this, so tune in next time and we will cover chapters 6 through 10.
Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.